Welcome to Artsplanations, the podcast that is for non-artists, artists, and everyone in between.
Each week, we ask a different search engine a question related to art, and then we talk about it.
Hello, and welcome back to Artsplanations. I am Joanna Bolsons, and with me, as always, is
Andrew Malcheski.
And today we're going to be asking the question, what is sculpture?
Yeah, so if you go onto your local friendly search engine like Ekoru, and you look up what is sculpture, you get a Encyclopedia Britannica article that says that sculpture, an artistic form in which hard or plastic materials are worked into three-dimensional art objects. The design may be embodied in freestanding objects, in reliefs on surfaces, or in environments ranging from tableau to contexts that envelop the spectator. Which, I mean, I guess, yeah, that is what you would think of as sculpture.
Yeah, it's in the round. It's a 3D object in the round.
Traditionally, yeah.
Yeah, but that's the point we're getting at. Traditionally, like, okay, there's marble, there's bronze.
There's wood, there's clay.
Yeah, we wanted to discuss more of non-traditional sculpture and kind of question the idea, is that a sculpture? Is it more of an installation? Kind of discuss some of our favorite artists and just, again, ask the question, what is sculpture, and kind of discuss.
So I was recently watching a talk by the sculptor Charles Ray from about 5 years ago when he had a retrospective at the Art Institute of Chicago. And he said something that I've also said in the past, but he did it much more eloquently. And he said that the primary medium of the sculptor is space. And that is spot on in my opinion. Any kind of sculpture, whether it's traditional or even the contemporary stuff we're going to be talking about, the main thing that they're doing is they are investigating the space that they live in, how they react to that space, and then how the viewer reacts to them, and the viewer themselves in that space are affected.
Right, and when you say space, just so everybody understands, if you were to say take a 5-foot sculpture and fit it in a tiny little dorm room, it's going to take up most of that, quote, space.
Right.
So either that's intentional or the artist is the student and has limited space to work in. So investigating the space that your piece will be in, that's more of what he was saying, correct?
Yeah. So a really good way to kind of understand what I mean when I say sculptures are investigating space and the role that sculpture has in space is to look at one of the greatest sculptors of all time, Bernini. If you look at his baldachin at St. Peter's, and you just look at a picture of it without anybody else, with no figures in the picture itself, it looks like this massive canopy inside this building. And you're like, oh, that's a canopy, it's in this building, it's kind of interesting. And then if you look at that same sculpture, but with people there, and you realize that this is like a 60-foot tall canopy that dominates the space, but it only dominates when it's next to a figure, and you see how massive it is.
Yeah.
Because not only did he design the baldachin, he designed the architecture surrounding the baldachin, and so he had complete mastery of the space. He also did this for the Ecstasy of St. Teresa and many of his other sculptural works, where he was not just the sculptor of the things that we see, but he's also the master architect who designed the space they lived in, and so the things were created for that specific space. And even the Ecstasy of St. Teresa, you can see reproductions in other spaces. You can see how they don't quite fit right, and some of the grandeur of the sculpture itself is lost because it's not in its space that it was made for.
That's interesting. One that always strikes me too is you see all the pictures of David and you see, some video of people visiting it. But I saw this one picture. What?
Which David? Because there's the Donatello David, the Michelangelo David, and the Bernini David, which is another really interesting kind of art historical look at the progression of how these sculptors approached the same subject matter.
It's Michelangelo's David sculpture. Mm-hmm. I've seen pictures of it. I've never been fortunate enough to see it in person. But I would see it on, PBS or in textbooks and stuff, and it's a figure of a man. So naturally you already think in terms of a standard size man.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't expect it to be more than 6'5" or something, like
Right.
one of the taller men that I know. But I saw a picture of it getting cleaned and seeing how large it actually is. So, this person is on scaffolding just cleaning the face,
Mm-hmm.
and this person maybe comes up to his knee. I'm not really sure because he's on that stand too. But just seeing the massive amount of space that it takes up kind of took me back. I was like, oh wow, I didn't really think, because you have to memorize dimensions or whatever for art history, but those are just numbers. But seeing it in person and seeing it compared to another figure was pretty fun.
Yeah, there's a great picture of Malvina Hoffman on some sculpture she did in England. It's like American England United. These massive 15-foot tall figures in marble. And you can see her sitting on the shoulders carving out the hair. And like the head is pretty much the size of her entire torso.
That's fun.
And if you don't see that picture, you just kind of see a picture of the finished thing. You know it's big because it's in a building, but you don't fully appreciate like how much that impacts the space. The same thing when you actually go in person to see it. Looking up at these things and being in the presence in the space, it affects the way that you view it and the way that you feel about that sculpture.
Also, one thing that I think we should point out, whenever you're working that large, not only do you have to think about the space, like you said,
Mm-hmm.
that it's going to be put in, but you also have to think about how the viewer is going to be able to view it. Because if you're looking up at a sculpture that's in some kind of inset of a building, the portions are going to be slightly off. So a lot of sculptors would have to elongate the legs or the neck, because when you're looking up it's shortened. So
Yeah.
you want it to look as natural as possible, but you have to plan to actually make it different than what it should be.
Yeah.
So that when you're looking at it from 10 feet below, it looks proportionate.
Right.
Which I'm not sure I could do, especially if I'm carving out of marble.
Right.
Like to be able to plan, oh no, this neck is actually going to be 3 feet because it's going to be up 10 feet in the air. So when you're looking at it, it'll look proportionate. There's no way I could do that.
Yeah.
Because I'd be so worried about screwing up that marble.
Yeah. I mean, Michelangelo's David was made to sit on top of a building. It was meant to be high up. And so he carved it so that the proportions, if you look at it at eye level, are wrong. Because it's meant to be viewed from underneath and about, 100 feet up or whatever. There's a great quote that a friend of mine who carves marble told me, and that's that in marble you don't make mistakes, you just make everything smaller. And ever since he told me that, I've been like, yeah, that's why I hate working in like plaster or marble, because I want to be able to add to it if I make a small mistake in the proportions, instead of, okay, now I have to carve the whole thing just a little bit smaller. So, like we said, we don't want to talk about traditional sculpture. As you can tell,
Even though
we've already kind of touched on it, we both have, a deep love for the classics and those traditional mediums, and, the Renaissance artists and the artists who kind of led up to our contemporary era of sculpture making in general. But I think a good place to start when we talk about contemporary sculpture is with the earthworks. This is a movement of sculpture making that I don't want to say started in 1970, but it kind of had its biggest surge of creation in that area.
So when you say earthworks, you're talking about spiral jetty and stuff?
Spiral jetty, sun tunnels, those kind of things where the medium is quite literally nature and the earth, and positioning something within nature. So using like the alignment of the stars or solar happenings as part of the work itself. Because sun tunnels is the massive concrete tubes that you would see put in for like sewage and stuff, but they're set up with holes drilled in them that align on the solstices, I believe, and various astrological dates. The stars will line up to make these constellations that perfectly come through these holes.
Oh, that's interesting.
And then spiral jetty is a massive jetty that was built in Salt Lake, Utah. And it's another one that the piece itself is made from the earth of the area. And it's this massive thing, much like the Nazca lines, if you think like traditional earthwork. That's why I don't want to say they started in the 1970s, because...
Right. They were just more, like, they were being called these earthworks. It wasn't just like...
The Nazca lines, or, the chalk giant in the hills in England, or, the giant heads in...
Easter Island?
Eastern Island.
The thing is, though, when I hear about Spiral Jetty specifically, and there's another artist, because Spiral Jetty, for those that don't know, it's just an arrangement of rocks, and is that the one I'm thinking of?
Mm-hmm.
It's an arrangement of rocks, and it goes out into the water, and it spirals in on itself, and so Spiral Jetty, spiral of rocks, obviously. Mm-hmm. There's another one, too. He would go out into the woods, and he would collect leaves and organize them by different color.
Yeah, Andrew Goldsworthy.
Okay. And so he would have like the bright yellow and gold right next to the tree, and then it would slowly go out to orange, to burnt red, to brown. Mm-hmm. And so it looked like the tree was glowing and alive. Mm-hmm. But my point of saying what the materials were that were being used, that's not a sculpture. To me, that's an installation.
But isn't an installation a sculpture?
No.
Why not?
Because an installation is ephemeral. It's going to be taken down. It's going to be discarded, especially those with the leaves and the rocks. That's not going to last forever. Nature's going to take that over.
A painting's not going to last forever.
True, but its intent is to last as long as possible. This is accepting the fact that it will be washed away. A painting is cared for, it's cleaned, it's got a provenance so that you can pass it down to your family members or you can sell it. These are not.
Then what? I mean, it's clearly a work of art. It's a thing created by a person that other people agree has an aesthetic merit. It's a work of art. So if it's not sculpture, then what is it?
An installation.
I don't know. I think installation is part of sculpture. Because you're still...
I think it can be an offshoot. Absolutely. But to call it specifically a sculpture, I don't think it's that. I think it's an installation. That's like saying that Felix Gonzalez, his candy pieces, those are installations.
They're sculpture.
They're installations.
They're sculpture. It's a three-dimensional thing. It is developed in the round. It investigates the space, and his specifically investigate not just like the physical space that you're in, but also the intellectual space with which they encompass.
But he didn't create those tiny pieces of candy. They are not stuck together in that specific space. They are dispersed to the patrons that partake. They are moved throughout the space, depending on the weight. It is an installation.
So for you, sculpture has to be static. It cannot...
No, because there can be those kinetic sculptures. Like,
But what I'm saying is, the sculpture itself, it has to be static. It has to retain its initial form. It can't change. It can't mutate or become something new throughout the course of its lifetime. Because there are lots of sculptures that they use time as part of the medium. They want the melting of the ice to expose the inside and then disappear as part of the piece, so that it's the thing that you can only experience once. That moment in time of the person in the space experiencing it.
No, I don't think it has to be stagnant like that. Like there are those butter sculptures that aren't going to last forever. They'll melt eventually. Right. There's that one that we recently saw.
Just like Andrew Goldsworthy's stuff. So wouldn't those butter sculptures also just be an installation? Because they're going to melt. Someone's going to put that on their bread. It's going to be, consumed, much like the Gonzalez Torres candy pieces.
No.
Why not? See, that's the interesting thing.
I think it's because it's the material.
So sculpture is a medium-specific matter.
No. And that's the whole point of this episode. It's not medium-specific, but I think whenever you're arranging a bunch of pieces, that eventually the wind is going to blow it away, or the sea will take the stones out, into the ocean. I think it's an installation.
But Spiral Jetty isn't going to go anywhere. It would get covered up by water, and then as the water recedes, it will, come back. But the chances of it disappearing are the same as saying, well, bronze is an installation because in a million years it will be gone. It has the same longevity of life that, a traditional sculpture, a piece of marble would have.
Well, then that argument could be used for Stonehenge then, and I don't think Stonehenge is a piece of sculpture. I think it's architecture.
What is architecture? I mean,
I'm not discarding it as not art.
Right.
I am just saying that those types of things, for me, falls more into the category of installation.
That's interesting because I always put them in the category of sculpture. Even like at Goldsworthy stuff, which his work specifically is designed that almost nobody sees it up close unless he's making an installation for a gallery or a museum.
He's the one that does the leaves?
Yeah.
Okay, so by your argument then, hang on, by your argument then, because he has to document this to prove that he did it, so is the artwork then the leaves next to the tree, or is it the photograph where he's having to document it?
Yes.
Which one?
Well, both. And that's the thing, like his work is all about the ephemera of nature. And when he builds those things, he doesn't use string, he doesn't use glue.
No, he doesn't. Yeah.
All he uses is what he finds in nature. He'll use thorns and water from the stream, and he will stick them together that way. All of his stuff, which is one of the things that makes his work so striking and so compelling, is that it is only things he finds in nature. And some of them, like the rain shadows, where he goes and lays down in a rainstorm, and when he gets up, there's the dry spot of where he was, and he documents it. Is it the documented image, the work of art, or is it the act of him doing it, and the documentation is the only way to share it?
Okay, well, keeping up that argument, it's no longer than... Well, he's doing it by himself, right?
As far as I know, it might be him and a photographer or
but
someone.
He might be taking the photographs
he might be as well. I'd have to look in to see if he has
if he had an audience, he would be very similar to the Gatai group doing these art actions, where it's a performance.
Right.
And without that documentation, it's this one-off.
Right.
Like a performance, like a ballet or something.
Yeah, or like a stage show. And if you aren't recording a stage show, is it any less of a work of art or any less of a production or piece of theater?
I don't think it's any less. I think people, and myself included, just want to know how to categorize it.
Yeah. I mean, that's how we, it's how we deal with stuff. We categorize them so that we can kind of understand based upon categories. But I think that idea of that's why I like the idea of the earthworks in contemporary sculpture and art in general in a contemporary sense. I think you have to move kind of out of this idea that they fall into a single category. I don't think you can say like
they're
sculpture
not going to fall neatly into a box.
Yeah. Whereas, up until about the 1900s, you could say sculpture is a thing made out of stone and bronze.
Yeah.
It is a thing that you put on a pedestal. Or as some of the critics of the 60s would say, it's the thing you bump into as you look at painting.
So keeping with the idea of architecture and time and nature, we should talk about James Turrell then, because he uses all of those.
Yeah. And James Turrell is probably one of my most favorite sculptors, contemporary sculptors living today. And he does work that uses often light and the way that light affects the viewer by flooding them with an over sensation of light, either completely filling a space with a certain hue or using rooms that have holes in them to like the sky or other areas, and then he'll project light onto the walls or the ceiling that will react to the natural light coming through the hole.
Yeah, so there's one in Arkansas at Crystal Bridges Museum, so if you're close to that, you should definitely go see it. And either at sunset or sunrise, it has the hole up top with these different LED lights that I don't want to say go through a rainbow because it's very, very subtle.
It's and it's a color shift. It's not a rainbow color shift, but it's the natural hues you would find in a sunrise and sunset.
Yeah, and so as the sun's either rising or setting, depending on what time you're there, it plays with that openness in the ceiling. So it looks like either the sky has come down into that little space or it's, you know, infinitely higher than you. It plays with the idea of color theory and space, like you said, for sculpture. It's very, very beautiful and very calming.
Yeah, and I mean, the reason why we bring up this one, he's got them all over the country, but this one we actually had a chance to visit a couple years ago and experience ourselves. And one of the things that struck me most about it was as you're just staring at this hole, it's kind of like those magic eye pictures where you stare at the two dots, then you look away and everything is in the negative of the color.
Yeah.
It's kind of the same effect where the hole kind of falls away and you kind of forget that where the sky begins, where the building ends, and even like the space you're in until you break away from looking at it, because your entire field of vision is taken up by this hole and these changing colors.
Yeah. And I was actually lucky to see his other work in Las Vegas with a girlfriend, and it enveloped the whole room. I can't remember what store. It's like Coach or Prada or something. You have to call this handbag store and make a reservation, but it's in there, and I think it's up to 3 people. They'll let you in, but it's this not bright red, but almost like a fire red, and it envelops the whole room. And the way he's carved the walls, there's no like sharp edges, there's no
discernible breaks in the field.
So it feels like you're just floating in this warmth. It was very womb-like to me. And it was almost like I just kind of slid my feet on the floor because I was worried that it was playing tricks, so that if I stepped, there might be a step that I just don't realize. It's very, very interesting, and I encourage everybody to go see any of his pieces.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that his work does, is it creates this moment in time where you have this experience with the work itself, where the work, it's not just an object that you see, but part of it is the experience. Much like the color field paintings by Rothko. It's not just about the image that you see, but about the experience you have with the image, with the work itself. And with Terrell, it's all about him controlling the space and using either artificial light or the natural light and artificial light together to create a space where you have a visceral reaction to it, whether it's calming or anger or just confusion and disorientation, because you suddenly no longer know where you are within it. And if that can be sculpture, if that's sculpture, then surely, Spiral Jetty, a thing which is a large thing in space.
I mean, is it sculpture? He didn't make the room. He designed it. So is he then just the designer? Is he an architect?
Is
he an electrician because he changed the color and he wanted this specific lighting? There's all these... I'm laughing because there's all these different questions. There's all these different things you can categorize it as. It doesn't really matter.
No.
Do you enjoy it? Does it spark?
Right.
And does it spark some kind of feeling? Does it make you question? Does it make you angry? Do you absolutely hate it? That's the whole point of art. It's to either enjoy it, to make yourself question, or just to feel some kind of emotion, even if it's unpleasant. That's all that matters.
It really is. The thing is, there is this idea of like the tortured artist in the room creating this masterful work that he's working by himself on, herself, yeah. Like, let's say Michelangelo and the sculptor David. There's this idea that like, he was this smelly sculptor who worked on this marble by himself and he created this thing. But the reality is that's never the fact. Somebody else picked that block. He didn't pick it. Somebody else probably carved it down and roughed out the shape that he wanted, and then he went in and did the detail layer. he didn't do that. He didn't spend hours chiseling away to get the rough shape of the figure out of it. He's too important.
Well, that's because he was also already recognized in his heyday. There
Right.
might be some of those that really did. There's that one, he died. Remember his wax?
He was working on a clay.
Yeah, and he
think it was
used
in-
his only blanket to protect his artwork,
Yeah, I forget.
and he froze to death. That's because he wasn't recognized in his lifetime.
Right. But any of the marbles we see today that are by any noted sculptor that you're like, oh, he's a master of, a Renaissance master, this big name, Michelangelo, Donatello, Raphael. Even those guys, Da Vinci, they didn't paint the entire painting themselves either. They had a studio assistants who did all the underpainting for them and laid everything out based on their drawings. Like, if you think that they were there tracing their cartoon onto the wall for the fresco, you're probably wrong. There might be instances where they did it, but chances are they were, paying some 3 or 4 studio assistants who were apprentices in their shop. That was their job, was to go and do the grunt work. Same thing with modern sculptors. Look at, Damien Hirst. Famously, he sold 1,000 of those spot paintings, and his aides later came out and said, yeah, he painted maybe 7 actual spots out of the 1,000 paintings. So he didn't even paint them. He had his aides just put them on based on his concept.
Well, who is it that does the blown glass?
Chihuly.
He doesn't actually do anything with the glass. He does watercolors and
Yeah.
has the studio assistants make them.
Right, because, one, he physically can't anymore. He's lost the ability to.
Oh, I thought he just couldn't do it, period. I thought he never knew how.
No, he knows how. He's a master glass blower. But
I
he
did not know that.
damaged his eyes, so he doesn't have the depth perception, and he's old now.
Oh.
It's the same thing with, Louise Bourgon. Bourgon?
Bourgeon, I think.
Louise Bourgon? However you say her name. Wonderful sculptress.
Oh!
She did the large...
Louise Bourgeois.
Bourgeois, that's it. Once again...
I thought you meant Louise, like a male
No.
Louise. And so I was like, well,
Louise
this is a different...
Bourgeon. Once again, the reason why I am a horrible at art history is I can never not only remember the names of the artists, but I also can't pronounce their names.
Yeah, she used to sit in front of her work and cry. Because didn't she go blind?
I don't think she went blind. I know that she wasn't recognized until much later in her career, and by that point she needed a studio aid to do a lot of the heavy lifting for her because she could no longer...
She does those
physically-
giant wooden that are all either it's completely black or completely gray, right?
I don't know, maybe. I know her from the giant spider, and the spider she did.
Yeah, that one's at Crystal Bridges
That's
too.
yeah, which is why I thought of it. That idea of the artist who is the only person who touches the work is a complete fallacy. And so when you think about someone like Terrell, he didn't build the walls, it's just a design carried out. Does that mean he's no longer the artist? And then who is the real artist? Is it the person who has the idea, or the person who sees the idea come to life? Or is it a collaboration, and should they each get an equal share?
Which we've talked about this before.
Right. But I do think that's an interesting thing to bring up and talk about. But I do want to kind of pivot back into sculpture. I feel like we've gotten just a little bit far afield.
And I think I'm thinking of a different artist that does the monochrome wooden wall sculptures. I don't think that was Louise Bourgeois.
I don't think so either.
Yeah, she definitely did the spider, but
Yeah.
I'm thinking of somebody else then. She did these giant... It's gonna bug me now. But she did these giant wooden... It's like different wooden boxes all arranged to take up a whole wall. But she would paint it...
I know what you're talking about.
She would paint it all black.
Yeah. Oh, I totally know what you're talking. I can't remember who she is either. If I saw her work, I would know it.
Yeah, I know exactly. And as soon as I go to the card and that's the female name, I know you.
Yeah. So another interesting sculptor to talk about is Marcel Duchamp and his ready-mades. Once again, here's a person who he's not making the thing. All he did was he found the things and stuck them on a stool or a pedestal and said, "Ready-made, I found this art." Is that sculpture?
I think it depends on the intent. Because wasn't he also doing that kind of thumbing the nose at the gallery? Because at first he did it under a pseudonym, and they didn't accept it.
Yeah.
And then he said, "Oh, that's my piece," and they accepted it. And I think he was having a laugh that it's no longer about how good I am, it's about my name.
Yeah. Which, also an idea of just like, because it's in a gallery, it is art.
Right.
Even though I didn't do anything with it, I just stuck it in there.
That's why I kind of have an issue with his ready-mades. I like his mobiles, his kinetic sculptures and stuff. Mm-hmm. But when I think of ready-mades, I think of Nam June Pak and his like TV garden.
Yeah.
Duchamp, just because of that alone, just rubs me the wrong way.
But getting back to that idea of who is the artist, I mean, here it's the idea. Like, he's the artist because he had the idea. He came up with this concept. And I think that is why, one of the reasons why those particular works are important, because it's one of those beginning questions that questions the institution, not only the institution, but the space of the institution. What does that even mean?
Yeah.
And how can that space elevate something as banal as a urinal or a bicycle tire? And so I think that was the conversation he was having, and because he was doing it in a time where people didn't do that.
Wasn't he during the Bauhaus movement, though?
I believe he was in turn of the century. I want to say 19-something. But that's also, I mean, Bauhaus is the 22s, right? 1922 to... so yes, that same idea, Duchamp in, the 20s, the Bauhaus group,
the Dadaists,
they're all beginning to question, really pushing that question of what is art, and also what is the art space, and
what does a gallery have to do with it? Because they were very against the gallery.
That, once again, it's artists fighting against the institution, which we've seen artists have done since, there was an institution. At some point, the institution says no to someone, and then the artists go up and do their own thing, and then eventually they become the institution, and then they say no.
Group revolts against them. Like, it's never ending.
Yeah.
But I feel it pushes for innovative ideas, and
right.
we wouldn't have any kind of progression as a society without it.
Right. Especially in our field, where we would still be doing landscapes, and there would be a hierarchy of like, the portrait is less than the landscape, and the landscape is greater than the still life, or whatever that hierarchy was.
Which, speaking of still life, just side note, was that their Instagram food pic?
Probably. Yeah, right? Like, check out my sweet meats and a lemon.
Like, I can afford grapes and a whole gourd and a roast suckling pig, whereas you guys, you peasants, have potatoes and cabbage soup.
Right. Look at my ultra rare and extremely exotic watermelon.
Ooh, cantaloupe.
Oh, right?
But getting back to sculpture.
Yeah. So another thing that I think sculpture investigates a lot, one of those things you don't think about with sculpture is time. Time plays a large part in contemporary sculpture, especially if you're talking about installations. Things like Terrell, or even stuff like Jason Hackenworth, who's an artist that we both got to see when we were in school.
Yeah, I got to work with him.
He does these large installations with balloons.
And his is also performative, because he would make outfits for these people to wear and kind of dance around or walk around, or, depending on what they were wearing, what their bubble costume was, or balloon costume, not bubble costume. They would do these movements within the crowd to get them energized and, have fun. Is what they're wearing and what they're doing, is that still sculpture, or is that a performance art?
Yes. And I think that's, once again, that's the thing. It's both. It's the line between, theater and visual arts. That line is disappearing. I mean, look at like Tufik, another he is a performance artist.
Yeah.
He doesn't make things except for videos.
People who aren't as involved in the scene, they know Blue Man Group.
Right.
Like,
are they visual artists or auditory artists, or are they both?
Are they performance artists or are they actual artists? Because they'll sell their little splash things that they do at their shows in the gift shop. You know, blurring that line is what's so fun, and pushing the question, like, well, does it matter what I am?
I mean, why would you want to limit yourself to a single medium?
Exactly.
Like, I certainly don't. I'm all over the place.
Yeah, like, you get bored with one thing.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's also a product of, you know, the fact that we live in the digital age, you know, the information age, where traditionally you were an apprentice to a master and you only had time to learn the one medium, to master it, so that you could make a living at it and support yourself and your family.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't have the free, if you did have some free time, you could use it to go out and hang out with friends, meet a girl, start a family. But you didn't have a bunch of free time or the ability to get the information because those masters weren't telling anybody else unless you were an apprentice, and they would hold back information until you got to journeyman and your own mastery. And so, like, I think because we live in an age where I can go online and learn how to screen print, I can go online and I can learn how to carve marble, I can go online and learn how to build things for my home studio that let me practice other forms of art that up until, you know, recently, those were proprietary secrets of the trade.
Or something you had to do on your own, you know, with libraries. You could read a book. You can maybe take a class at a community college or some kind of center, but it was very limited on your options depending on where you lived.
Yeah. If you were in a rural community, you might have a painting class and a ceramics class, but you probably wouldn't have, like, a class that investigated the time arts or, like, installation art or stuff like that.
What I think is great about the time that we're living in now is that not only do people have more access to learning these things, but the psychological benefits are becoming more known and more acknowledged. So people who are going through either emotional therapy or even physical therapy, they're encouraged to do something in the arts to help with their hand-eye coordination or just helping with their emotional release. So they're finding these passions and they're finding these talents that were otherwise hidden because they had too much time or too little time because of work or whatever.
Right.
So, and even during the pandemic, getting to see all my friends, like, follow a hobby more because they couldn't go out drinking like they normally do, and we didn't have to physically go to the office, so my drive time was cut way down. It was really, it sucked because it was a whole year of not seeing our friends and family, but it was really fun seeing them digitally getting to grow in that aspect.
Yeah. And so to pivot back into sculpture.
Yeah, we kind of got off topic.
Yeah, welcome to the podcast. But I mean, I think, you know, for me, like I said, as long as it's an investigation into space, that's really that's the bar for me into what is sculpture. And so, you know, when I went to undergrad, performative art and installation art, those were part of the sculpture program. Like, if that was something that you wanted to do, that was a thing you did as a sculptor. Like, you wouldn't do that in painting, you wouldn't do that in time arts, you would do that in sculpture class. And I had several of the other students with me who they explored that as a medium.
I think one that I've really liked recently, and I'm going to mispronounce this, is Sigalet Landau. She did the Salt Bride, where she submerged her dress in the Dead Sea, and so it slowly, over time, time being one of the key words in this, crystallized and became like a sculpture, so it could stand on its own, or I'm sure she held it up somehow, but I was really intrigued by that because it's more than just
ephemera.
Well, not just that. It was more than just the dress itself. It was the time aspect.
Right.
And then nature getting involved. It's how is it going to last? Is it going to last?
Right.
That was, like I said, it was just one of my more recent finds that I really enjoyed.
Yeah. And those are kind of the things also, like, as artists, like, we need to make a living, and we generally do that by selling something, like either an experience to someone, come into this room that I've built all this stuff in and have this experience,
Yeah.
or, you know, view this book of all these images I've taken of this thing that you can no longer experience, or buy this sculpture.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the things with, like, you know, ephemeral art and time-based art. How do you make that sustainable in your practice?
How do you monetize it to sustain yourself?
Right.
But is that, if you're doing something with time, if you want it to be ephemeral, is that the point then, to make a living from it?
I don't think it's the point, but I think it's a consideration that you,
I think it's a,
it's
a necessity, because we all have to live, but it's definitely something that you have to question, like, your intentions behind a piece of work. If you're dealing with ephemerality, if that's
Right.
a word, should you even charge something to see a picture of it?
Right.
Should you even take a picture?
And that has to be a consideration, because putting a price tag on something changes the viewer's response to that thing. You know, gating something off and making it so you have to go through these hoops to get in to see a thing will change your appreciation for it.
Yeah.
Either positive or negative, one way or the other, but it does affect the overall way in which you view it. Well, I mean, I think those are some of the considerations that the contemporary sculptor has to take into account.
Contemporary viewer, too.
And the contemporary viewer. I mean, and also the way in which we view things is changing so fast with technology. You know, 20 years ago in 2000, or 30 years ago in the early 90s, online gallery, ha ha ha, no way. Like, that was like a crazy idea. Now, online galleries, like, yeah, of course, there's a million of them.
Yeah.
Hey, you want to do an online gallery? Sure, no problem. We can host it on Instagram. We can put it up on the web. We can now do VR galleries where you put on a headset and you digitally move through the space. And so as the technology grows, you know, that idea of, like, what is sculpture and also what is space? Like, a 3D artist working virtually in a digital space, like, there's no physicality to that. Everything is just little ones and zeros at that point.
Who are we as people, Andrew? What are we doing here? What is this life?
Yeah, but it's something that you kind of have to keep track of if you want to stay on the cutting edge of mediums.
So before we close out, though, are there some favorite sculptors that you want to name drop?
Oh man, I mean,
I should have done this last. I should have gone first, because you're going to start talking for about 4 solid minutes.
No, I'll just, you know, obviously, Bernini. If you want to talk about one of the greatest classical sculptors of all time. Also, Proudhon, the French portrait sculptor. Another one of those mashes of marble. Melvina Hoffman, who's probably my most favorite female artist of all time. Another amazing sculptress. You know, James Turrell, Felix Gonzalez Torres, Charles Ray. I like the work of Barry X. Ball just because he's one of those artists who is taking very traditional contemporary things and reproducing them using like 3D printing and printing marbles and stuff. It's very kind of like a new way to look at a traditional way of making a thing. There's some others, but right now their names escape me.
Yeah, I'd like to add Camille Claudel, Judy Chicago, Yayoi Kusama, who we're going to hopefully talk about soon.
Yeah, we're going to go see one of her Infinity Rooms.
Yeah, we've seen one before, and we're going to go see a new one soon.
Yeah.
Which, actually, we should have mentioned her earlier, because she did those soft sculptures. And, again, I think it's because of the intent behind it. But how is a soft sculpture different than, say, a teddy bear, or just a stuffed animal in general? Are those considered sculptures then?
Yes.
Right? Like... Is it because it's a fabric? Is it then a textile? But how is a dress not a sculpture that you wear?
Well, right? I mean, I think it's one of those things like, what is art? Well, everything's art. Same with sculpture. Well, what is sculpture? Well, anything in space can be sculpture, or could fall under that name. That's why I think it's the investigation of space that really defines sculpture for me. Whereas a dress isn't so much about the space, but about the person wearing the dress. It's an accent to the wearer, not to the space surrounding it.
I don't know, because if you look at ballet costumes or theater costumes, then you got to think about color theory, because you're trying to showcase a specific character.
Yeah.
And same with stuffed animals, or soft sculptures in general. You choose your fabric depending on what you're trying to invoke.
Yeah.
I don't know, just something that I would like to bring up before we close out. I wish I had thought of that earlier.
Yeah, and I think you're right. And I think that's why, like, once you start thinking about that idea of, like, okay, well, then what is sculpture? And you start to think about, well, if this is sculpture, then why isn't this considered sculpture?
Yeah, which is why we want to have this episode, because it's one of those questions that you don't really think about. You just automatically assume, oh, that's a sculpture, this is a painting. There's that hard line, but
right.
Nowadays it's so blurred.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that, people like Duchamp and Turrell, like, by challenging the notion of the institutional space, you suddenly do blur that line and break it down, and it opens you up to the idea that, oh, these things that we don't think of as works of art can be works of art. That these things that we don't think of as sculpture, they can be sculpture. We can view them through that lens. So, do you have any other sculptures that you'd like to throw out?
No, right now I'm just trying to think of different argumentative points for how to argue for
the restrictive classification of sculpture?
No, how to argue for
installations not being sculpture?
No, for how costumes can be not just an art form, because I think it's already widely accepted that it is, but how it can fall under the category of a sculpture.
Well, would you say that fashion is then a subset of sculpture?
That's what I'm trying to get organized in my head right now, is how to fabricate my arguments for that. Because I think in a way it can be.
Yeah. I also think I don't know enough about fashion and the industry of fashion. I feel like the industry of fashion plays such a large part in the cultural perception of fashion, quotes, fashion.
Yeah, I think it's
fashion with a capital F.
Yeah, and I have a hard time swallowing the elitism in it.
Right.
And, they'll make 30,000, I don't want to say the wrong name, but say it was 30,000 Birkin bags, but they only sell 22, they'll burn the rest of them.
Isn't that Vuitton that does that?
Is it Louis Vuitton? See, that's why I was worried about saying...
I don't know.
That's why I was worried about saying a name, but whoever it is, they'll burn the rest of them, so that, one, they don't have to sell it at a cheaper price, but two, it also plays into that idea of you have something of a limited number.
Right.
You have this...
exclusivity.
Yeah, exclusivity, this thing that you can feel superior because you have one that not many people have. It's just that I have a hard time swallowing that.
And that's the thing, like, fashion is so tied into a market sensibility.
Mm-hmm. It's like it's not unlike our gallery system, but when it comes to fashion, the whole thing is a gallery.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we can do that on another episode.
Right.
Let's harken back to sculpture.
Yeah. So, I think that this was a very good kind of opening look at contemporary sculpture and kind of the where people see sculpture. That's why you'll see some weird things and you're like, how is that considered sculpture? And hopefully this kind of opens you up to the idea that, oh, that's kind of the idea.
Yeah.
What kind of led up to some of those things.
And then even if you see something, it's like, no, that can't be a sculpture because of whatever. Hopefully we've helped you form an argument that is stronger.
And I think much like what is good art, it's something that you kind of have to define for yourself.
Yeah.
And, you view installations as a separate thing from sculpture, whereas I view them as part of the sculpture medium.
And maybe that's also because I wasn't taught another way.
Yeah.
I was taught this is old school.
Right.
This is traditional. This is this new wave stuff that, we're still trying to define ourselves.
Yeah. And I've seen installations and performance art fall under what's called 4D, the time arts.
You see, I was never taught that. It wasn't until I was doing art history that was even brought up. Mm-hmm. And even then it wasn't talked about in studio.
Right.
And, art students were typically in the same building as theater as well as music,
yeah.
But we're still separated.
Yeah.
So trying to break down those barriers of separation to show like we're all in this same kind of bubble together.
Yeah.
We're all in the liberal arts that have no funding.
It's all art.
Yeah.
We use the same language to describe the things we do: repetition, uniformity, line, shape, form. Those words
whether
are used
it's using your body or sound or whatever.
Notes or scales on a chord or whatever. Yeah. And so hopefully this will kind of broaden your horizons a little bit, make you interested in some of the people we've seen, to see what contemporary sculpture has to offer. Maybe it's reaffirmed that, no, you were right. Your ideas about what were sculpture were absolutely spot on.
Yeah, and if you want to, shoot me a message supporting me and it is an installation.
Or you can support my notion that she is 100% wrong and that it is sculpture itself.
We're going to have a poll on the website. We'll figure out how to put a poll on there.
Yeah, but I think that's our episode. So thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. If you would also like to put in your own 2 cents, please feel free to send us a message through our website or through Twitter or any of the mediums that you can find in the show notes.
But thank you for joining us. We've had a lot of fun today. So as always, I am Joanna Bolsons.
And I'm Andrew Malcheski, and hopefully you're still you.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. It means so much that you would take the time to listen to us. If you like what you hear and would like to help us out, please give us a review and like on your podcast app and iTunes. Comment and tell your friends and family. We would also like to thank the Joy Drops and Free Music Archive for our music.
We want to have a conversation. This means that any research we do for a subject is often done a week or 2 before we record, and our notes are minimal. This also means that as we talk about things, we might make mistakes, like in the pronunciation of names or the misattribution of a statement or a piece of work, and the messing up with titles and dates. If we do and we notice, we'll put a correction in the show notes. And if we don't, let us know so that we can.
The best place to contact us is on our website, www.artsplanations.com. There you can find out more about us, the show, and each episode.
You'll be able to find every artist quote and most of the specific vocabulary we use in each episode, as well as a list of upcoming topics.
We invite you to join the conversation, so please let us know what you think. If you have suggestions or topics for discussion, you can let us know at our website, www.artsplanations.com.
If you are curious about our artwork, the best place to find is on our Instagrams. I'm at Andrew Malcheski. That's at AndrewMalczewski.
And I'm at joanna.bolsons.artist. That's JOANNA.BOLSINS.ARTIST.
These links and others can be found on the Artsplanation website. That's www.artsplanations.com. www.artsplanations.com.